So our boss has decided they would like us to change our last query or our last procedure because they want the vendor name displayed in the output. So what we're going to have to do is basically get rid of or delete our old procedure, and we'll just create a new one. So we're still going to use AP on this. And I'm just going to put a little comment in here. We're deleting the procedure if it exists. So we're going to use the little if statement, and we're looking at the object ID. And we're looking for SP, vendor invoices. See if it's not null, which means it exists. And if it exists, we're going to drop the procedure SP vendor invoices, which means we're going to delete it. Okay. If it doesn't exist, then it's not there and we're good. We don't have to worry about it. And now we're going to create the procedure with the added column that our boss wants. So this is kind of like the old one, because I don't like to do a lot of extra typing. If I don't have to, let me see, here's our old one. I'm going to highlight this. And we need to add vendor name. So after the vendor variable, I'm going to put a comma and do another variable called vendor name. And they want the vendor name returned. Now we already have something that we are returning in the return statement, and you can only return one thing. So this has to be an output parameter. Okay, so that is, I'm going to put a little comment in here, an output variable. And this one, we'll put a comment in, this is a required input variable. And this one, because it's set to null, this is an optional input variable. So I've got two input variables, I got an output variable. And coming through our procedure code, the code for date is not going to change. What has to change is our select. So we have to set our output variable equal to the column that we want to retrieve, which is vendor name. So we've got invoice count, which we are returning through the return statement. And we have vendor name, which is going to be an output parameter. And we're going to have to return that a little bit differently. Because we added vendor name and we have our aggregate function here, that means we have to add a group by statement. So before the semicolon, we have to say group by vendor name. Okay, you always group by columns. This variable is what we are going to end up returning. Okay, so the rest of it is fine. We've already told SQL this is an output variable. So when we run this, okay, we'll put a little comment in here, run the procedure. When we run this, that is where we account for the output variable. So we are going to declare at vendor name. And you need to make it the same data type and size as you used up here. So now we've declared the output variable there. And we also are going to declare invoice count. If I can type, that would help. An integer. And now we'll do our exec statement. Invoice count is being returned So that has to go on the left side of our equal sign, because that is where the return statement is going to return the invoice count, and we're going to put it right here. And then we're going to be executing vendor invoices. And we're not going to give it a date. So we're just going to do 2 single quotes. And then for the vendor, we're going to do the ones that start with the letter A. And then for the output parameter, we're going to use the name, okay, at vendor name, and we're going to label it output. Okay, so this is going to match up with what we have inside the procedure, and it's going to store the vendor name that it returns right in our output variable. Now you might be wondering, well, could we have made invoice count an output variable? Yes, we could have. Okay, and if we did, then we would just do a comma, and we would have had at invoice count and labeled it output. Okay, we don't have to have a return statement. Okay, but for this example, we are returning invoice count, so you can see how a return statement works, and we're also using the output variable. So this will execute it, but in order for us to actually see the data, we have to do a print or a select. So we're going to go ahead and do a select so we can see what got retrieved or returned. And we're going to select the vendor name as vendor. So it'll put a little column heading of vendor at the top, comma, and then at invoice count, going to do as number of invoices. So it'll put that at the top of the column. Okay, and then we are going to go ahead and run this. So it's going to create the procedure, and then it's going to execute. Okay, so you can see that the vendor name, Abbey Office Furnishings, displayed with the vendor heading. We've got our invoice count of 1, displaying under number of invoices. So at this point, the boss is extremely happy with what we've done, and they would like one more thing displayed. They want the invoice date being used to display. So what we're going to do is pretty much, we'll just copy this whole entire thing, actually starting way up here. And we'll paste. And then we're going to move our closing comment down to right about here. So we're going to have to do the little drop on it again. And now we need to add another output parameter. So we're going to have to put a comma after output. And this one is going to be at vendor invoice date. And that is a small date time data type. And it is an output variable. We'll just go ahead and label that output variable. And we're going to basically handle this the same way we did vendor name. So after vendor name, I'm going to do a comma at vendor invoice date, and we're going to set that equal to our date variable. And remember, the date variable is going to be whatever was passed to us, or it's going to be the minimum invoice date. And now, because we still have count here, and we have group by vendor name, we have to now add the date in here as well. So we're actually grouping by the invoice date. Okay, and that is because that is what we're using up here. That is the column from the table that is generating our date variable. Okay, so remember when you do group by, has to be columns that are in your table. Okay, so we've got invoice date. And then we're going to have to modify our execute just a little bit. Because now we have two output variables, we're going to have to declare both of them. And it doesn't really matter what order you declare them up here. So, I mean, I could do it at the top, in the middle, at the bottom. I mean, as long as you declare it before your execute statement, that is what is important. All right, so we're declaring our vendor invoice date as small date time. And we've got the vendor name as output. And we also have the vendor invoice date now as output. And we're going to have to add that to our select as well. So after number of invoices, we're going to say at vendor invoice date as, we're going to say minimum invoice date. Although it might not always be the minimum, that's what we're going to label it as. All right, so after all of that, we are going to run this. Okay, and now we have the vendor, number of invoices, and we have the invoice date that was actually used in the procedure. So our boss is really into try and catch for error handling. And it probably is a really good idea to add that to your code, especially a stored procedure that users are going to run. So we're going to modify this. And right after the as, we're going to say begin try, because that's really where our code starts. And after the return, which is the end of our code, we're going to say end try. And if there's an error in there, then we have to do our catch. And I'm going to do an end catch. And in between, we're going to display the error. So we're going to say print an error occurred. And then we're going to print what the error message is. And we're going to convert the error message into character because we're using print. And then that is the end of the catch. As far as our run statement, we will modify this just a little bit and actually give it a date. Hopefully we don't miskey it, but at least now we have error handling. So I'm going to change the vendor to begin with M. I added a date of January 1st, 2010. And then the other two parameters are output parameters. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and run this. And remember, this procedure deletes the old one, creates a new one, and it'll create the new one with the try catch. And this should be indented. I'm a little bit anal about indenting my stuff. There, that looks much better. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and run it. And the output pretty much looks the same. The only difference is now we have error handling so that if the user actually sends bad data, it will display an error message. And we are going to comment this out.